In this news roundup of a week for 21st of October 2022. As expected, Liz Truss resigns as Prime Minister and the Tory Party is seriously considering Boris Johnson as a replacement. The EU remains divided on energy and Russia takes out a third of Ukraine's power grid, and China's Xi Jinping is established as de facto ruler for life, and the question remains, what comes next? And in this week's Short Thought, I reflect on how the real world will always impose itself on ideological fiction. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Unlike my usual hedging of bets and seeing both sides, in last week's episode I framed it unequivocally. The British Prime Minister was going down. It was, after all, about the easiest prediction ever. Once you get to a certain stage, it becomes self-reinforcing downward spiral, everything falls apart quite rapidly. And so it did. The Home Secretary resigned and put the boot in on the way out the door. Various others raised their voices to call for Liz Truss to go. Then there was a debate on fracking set up by the opposition, who probably can't believe how well it all played out, since because the Prime Minister and the government had zero authority left in their own party, they overplayed their hand in trying to force MPs to hold the line in favour of fracking. Some noted that this was the exact opposite of the manifesto commitment they'd been elected on, so of course some of the MPs at least were deeply unhappy about it. But then they were told it was a confidence motion, so if it was lost, the government would fall, there would be an immediate general election. And of course, if you fail to support the government in a confidence motion, you will lose the party whip as a result. Then towards the end it was suggested, well, it wasn't really a confidence motion, but then it was suggested, oh yes it was. Then there were tussles in the division lobbies as whips tried to manhandle MPs to vote the right way, and that led to the chief whip resigning, and then latterly unresigning, which I didn't know was a thing. And for many that was the final straw, or so they said. Quite a few had no straws left by this point. But it was brought home to Liz Truss that she was out of road, and yesterday she walked out of 10 Downing Street and finally announced that she was resigning. Now, you might hear all that and conclude that it's been a complete shambles and a huge embarrassment to the country. But in actual fact, well, yes, it has indeed been a complete shambles and an embarrassment to the country. So here's the plan if you're a conservative realist, it seems to me, assuming such people still exist. Replace Liz Truss as quickly as possible with a grown-up who can command the support of a majority of the parliamentary party, get them in position to be a steadying hand, give them unqualified support in doing so, and hope that you can pull back enough respect to reduce the size of the inevitable now rout at the next election. Ideologues and fantasists will believe that if only they can get their person in, they will magically, through the power of right thinking and right action, be able to turn around a massive deficit in support to win a majority at the next election. Total and absolute fantasists think that Boris Johnson would be that person. One of those fantasists, it turns out, is Boris Johnson himself, who is reportedly planning to put himself forward to get his old job back. Remarkably, he has attracted early support from a significant number of MPs. Some of those who crunch the numbers on this behind the scenes believe that he will have enough votes to get into the final two, which will then be put to the membership. And also remarkably, if that happens, it's thought likely that a majority of the membership will be inclined to vote for him. Given that it's not so long ago that Johnson's leadership dissolved with mass resignations of ministers following several years of chaos, you might well ask what on earth could be the appeal. The story is that Boris is the only election winner the party's got. After all, he won the Conservatives a large majority in the last election, which he did, but only at a time when the country was infuriated at the anti-Brexit parties who had spent 2 years actively trying to subvert the result of the 2016 referendum. Johnson was elected to get the job done once and for all. Also, he was up against Jeremy Corbyn, a man out of sight of the centre ground, not something that generally plays well with the electorate. The party started getting bad ratings because of the chaos and the sleaze under his watch. This is a word cloud from a late poll of what the country thought of him after a couple of years of him being Prime Minister. On YouGov, he was rated on the following characteristics: competence, -43, trustworthiness, -65, decisiveness, -35. Not intuitively the perception for the man of the next hour, you might think. The fact that even worse chaos since his time has made the ratings for the Conservative Party even worse than they were doesn't mean that they would recover to their former bad but not so bad levels if you decided to guarantee another 2 years of chaos. But then this is the problem for those conservative realists, and sadly for all of us who live in declining powers right now. When things degrade like this, they do so because of the growing self-indulgence and mutual intolerance of the ideologues. The party is now so divided, so ideological, so uninterested in how its fighting looks to the outside electorate, it's very doubtful that any candidate would actually be able to hold it together. I've generally concluded that anyone who actively wants the job of Tory leader and Prime Minister at the moment is frankly too dumb to be trusted with the job. The new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, immediately ruled himself out of contention. Well, that at least indicates he has some working brain cells. Give it to him. Or, I don't know, find some homeless person with a drugs problem. Still going to be better than recent performance. By the way, the plan, if you're the main opposition, is to call for an immediate election. I mean, no one in their right mind is going to grant it. Even the craziest in the ranks will understand they need a couple of years to rebuild some vague chance of surviving the forthcoming devastation. But the whole population will nevertheless agree with the principle that this has gone on long enough. And it's in the opposition's interest to be seen saying the things that people agree with, the common sense things, while the current government ignores them. And then they have to spend the next 2 years gaining gravitas, preparing themselves for government, giving serious speeches of intent, holding party discipline together, looking as though they're grown up and making sure they don't make stupid mistakes. That's pretty much a description of how it was for Labour under Tony Blair from 1995 to 1997, at least as related by former Home Secretary Jackie Smith recently. When you know it's yours to lose, you become extremely risk-averse, making sure you don't do anything to change the existing dynamic before it delivers you the win. The current Labour Party isn't as cohesive as it was in Blair's time, but they probably want this enough, having been out of power for a decade, to follow the plan. Their main point of failure would be whether some of them begin to indulge the woke craziness. But even some light nuttiness in that direction will probably be relatively ignored, since every expectation is that the government is going to continue to be something of a shambles. Yes, they can elect Boris Johnson, and it will be a day-to-day shambles from the top, even as some MPs quit the party whip in protest. Or they could elect someone competent, who will then be faced with an ungovernable party, demonstrating to the country that whoever's the leader, it's not going to make that much difference. And in some ways, this is the only coherent argument the Boris backers really have, and it's telling how many of them are openly using it in justification for their support. Simply put, they now think it would be probably a good thing for the party to spend a period in opposition, time to sort itself out, but they are scared of the scale of the rout, the full-scale slaughter promised by some of the polls under Liz Truss and still right now. There's a desperate hope that if Boris can win enough of those seats back to mean the party survives relatively intact as it moves into opposition, then they can at least rebuild. And in, of course, a self-interested way, that particularly applies to all of those MPs who have looked at the list of all of those who would be defeated in a major rout. They've seen their own names there, so they're trying to keep their own seats. The latest poll had Conservatives on 14%. That would leave them not even big enough to be the official opposition in the new parliament. It's worth remembering that the Liberal Party was once considered the natural party of government, the party of Gladstone. It suffered, became a tiny rump within a relatively short period of transition. Don't presume it can't happen here. Boris backers think the only way to avoid it happening is to have Boris Johnson back as Prime Minister. Many others think that it would be a sure way to guarantee that very end. Whatever happens, the country needs grown-up leadership and stability, but for the time being can only wait. Elsewhere, the heads of state of the European Union watched the UK Conservative Party tearing chunks out of each other, reportedly with a smirk and a sense of schadenfreude, before getting back to the serious business of tearing chunks out of each other. In particular, the French are furious with the Germans for using their economic power to provide significant support to their own citizens in the face of the growing energy crisis, €200 billion worth, in fact, as I reported last week. Macron said that the scheme would create distortions in the market that would negatively impact everyone else, and he called for a European strategy, not for national strategies, by which he really means Germany should share more of its resources to the benefit of everyone else, not just to its own citizens. Berlin, in the meantime, whilst being relatively unattracted by that proposition, is also angered by France's lack of support for its attempts to revive a partially built pipeline linking Spain and France. Tensions between the two European leaders reached such a pitch that their usual annual joint cabinet meeting was postponed until next January. The head of the International Energy Agency warned that the European countries were heading towards a Wild West scenario, where they stopped collaborating with each other on energy supplies and fell instead into direct competition. Very much, of course, the hoped-for outcome for Vladimir Putin behind his deep cuts in gas provision to the EU. Of course, this week, Russia turned its hand seriously towards spreading the misery of the cold season to the people of Ukraine. Bombing attacks have taken out a third of the country's energy infrastructure, forcing it to begin a programme of rolling blackouts and encouragement to the citizens to save as much energy as possible. At the same time, Putin declared martial law in the occupied Ukrainian territories, apparently to suppress local resistance. That's local resistance from the population that was supposedly voting by 99% to welcome Russian rule, you'll recall. The move came also as the Institute for the Study of War said that Russian forces were creating the information conditions to conduct a false flag attack on the Kakhovka hydroelectric plant near Kherson. The resulting flood, should the dam be breached, would be devastating to a number of communities, but would also be able to cover a Russian retreat further south into Kherson Oblast. Ukrainian President Zelensky said that Ukrainian information likewise supported the intelligence that Russia had planted mines at the dam, which is currently under Russian control. Meanwhile, discontent is rising in Russia, albeit still some way from any kind of boiling point, over the evidence of the newly mobilised men being sent to Ukraine with no training and very little equipment. Some of those have sadly, but not surprisingly, been early casualties. The Moscow Times highlighted one example, Igor Puchkov, killed 10 days after being mobilised, having received no instruction before being sent to Kherson. His sister-in-law told the Times he was promised 2 weeks of military exercises, but they were only given 30 bullets, they shot once, and that was it. Such stories are doing the rounds, and while it's hard to get a real sense of public sentiment because so many distrust the pollsters and fear the consequences of any criticism of the regime, even there are some indicators of a dip in support. Albeit if you took the figures at face value, you'd say it was still trivial. While everyone else's politics seems to be in some amount of disarray, the 20th Communist Party Congress in China has been gliding apparently serenely on. For all the suggestions that Premier Xi Jinping was under pressure because of the consequences of his zero COVID policy and the hits to the Chinese economy from massive debt in the property sector, he has seen his authority largely confirmed and strengthened. Indeed, at the point of shooting this video, it was being suggested that he would be granted with the highly symbolic title of People's Leader in revisions to the party constitution, which would place him finally alongside Mao Zedong in terms of his status. In his inputs to the conference, President Xi confirmed his current priority list, defended his approach to zero COVID, and upped the focus on wealth redistribution and reining in the growth of the super-rich from some of the country's burgeoning businesses. This under what he has been framing in recent times as common prosperity. The idea that this might mean property and inheritance taxes on the wealthy, alongside a generally slowing economy, helped to bring Chinese stocks into decline. But unlike Liz Truss in the UK, Xi Jinping is not especially vulnerable to the short-term judgments of the market. The big questions do remain, however. Since Xi Jinping will now have crossed the hurdle and will feel secure in his position, what does this mean for what China does next? On the one hand, there's the historical role that Xi would like to play, bringing his country to world dominance in terms of its prosperity and reuniting the mainland with Taiwan, with all the geopolitical dangers that exercise will bring. At the same time, he's facing some real difficulties, with the shockwaves of Russia and Ukraine making the world situation very unstable, the likely economic recession made worse by zero-COVID lockdowns, and also the growing demographic issues the country faces. What do recent events mean for China's Taiwan ambitions? Well, on the one hand, you might think that Ukraine events would encourage it to revert to a more patient step-by-step approach, seeing the consequences of moving before the time is right. Its traditional approach. China is famously more long-term in its outlook, patient in its actions. But Xi Jinping has to some degree broken with such traditions in his time. It's simply not clear where his thinking is on this. Certainly, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said this week that the US fears that plans are being accelerated, not the reverse. Pointing to the large-scale military drills following Nancy Pelosi's visit, he said that this showed practical preparations in how its armed forces work together in a combined operation, which has been one of the signal failures of the Russian military during large parts of the Ukraine war. Now, such practical preparations are not new. In 2015, Xi laid out the project that was to turn the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, into a world-class fighting force that would be equal to the US equivalent. The target was set for that for 2049. But even now, the progress that's been made has been swift. China now has the world's largest navy, with brand new, large and powerful warships and aircraft carriers. Stealth fighter jets, a stealth bomber is on the way, significant arsenal of missiles. As Russia has demonstrated, of course, what looks impressive before a conflict simply may mask deficiencies that will become all too visible once the conflict has started. Since China's made a point of not getting involved with military entanglements in foreign countries, contrasting with the US, which has been consistently engaged somewhere in the world, what its forces lack is practical combat experience. Xi outlined in his speech this week that China had to become more adept at deploying its military forces on a regular basis and in various ways to enable it to, quote, win local wars. There is sound rationale for thinking you would not want to start that process with an invasion of Taiwan. The logistical challenge of moving large numbers of troops across the Taiwan Strait, it means it would be costly at best. It would have to utilise its expensive and extensive fleet of ships, while Taiwan would simply need to deploy small land-based anti-ship missiles, similar to what Ukraine has been using to considerable effect. To overcome that, you would need a well-functioning command system following an optimal military strategy. There are limits to how well you can learn to do that just by looking at Russia and saying, yeah, don't do it like that. So it's not surprising that Xi Jinping stated this week the need to improve the command system for joint operations, to improve the PLA systems for logistics and battleground support. Working on such command systems, as Blinken suggested, widely thought to have been the principal point of the exercises following the Pelosi visit, to use that cover of outrage at the American politicians to give it a degree of license to try out some of the coordinated operations that would be needed. So you'd conclude from all of that the critical moment won't arrive just yet. There's more work still to be done. But that said, as an analysis by CNN pointed out, 4 of the top 6 officers of China's military commission are due to retire. And those leaving are the ones who are actually in charge of the fighting forces. The replacement of these means that nobody with actual operational experience will be on the commission. In June, Xi Jinping signed an order for new guidelines on so-called non-war operations. What Non-war operations? Well, who knows? The Chinese media have been suggesting it could cover things like participating in international peacekeeping operations or providing disaster relief. Others have wondered if the language might be non-war operations, in the same way that, according to Vladimir Putin, having his tanks roll through Ukraine, bombing cities and taking over territory counts as a non-war operation. Whatever does come next, it's clear that China's building its military infrastructure with the expectation of a different and more assertive role on the world stage. It remains committed, it says, to non-interference in other nation states, the kicker being that Taiwan isn't counted as such by them, of course. But you only have to look to see how it claims large parts of the South China Sea against standard norms to understand that it doesn't have to invade a country to increasingly use its power in ways to maximise its own interests. If you don't see the world clearly, you'll fail to change it, maybe even to survive it. It's one of the things I say most often on this channel, but in polarised times, all the evidence is we're moving in the opposite direction. Whenever things go wrong, people blame whatever it was that they already didn't like, regardless of whether there's the slightest evidence for a causal link. The current chaos is all because of Brexit, some people say, simply because anything bad that happened after 2016 could only be the fault of Brexit in their opinion. Alternatively, the energy crisis is specifically and wholly because of net zero policies, others say, in spite of the historical record of what decisions were actually taken and when. The failure of Liz Truss's government seems to me to be a signal lesson in what happens when you try to change the world on a faulty understanding of reality. Ideologues on all sides always think things can be changed more quickly than they can. They always underestimate the amount of opposition radical actions will provoke, and they often massively underestimate the unintended consequences their proposals would have. When you do a thing and get a totally unexpected result, it's because you didn't see reality clearly when you were deciding what the thing was that you should do. Truss's faith in a radical policy agenda designed to kickstart growth, almost immune to any sense of the context of the extraordinary time we're in, this was arguably the failure of the ideologue. Now, ideologues on the other side, the eco-extremists for instance, they will often dismiss my point of politics being the art of the possible with the argument that, well, that's all very well, but there isn't time. This is an example in action. What happens when you try to go too quickly at a time, when your initiative runs counter to the reality of circumstance? Total and abject failure with consequences. The problem with ideologues is that the delusion and disconnection from reality that results from living in a bubble means you become incapable of learning these lessons, because you'll always find some way to rationalise failure, why it was someone else's fault. One reason why communists for many decades made the no true communism argument. Yes, it failed every single time it had been tried, but only because nobody had done it properly. Now, don't get me wrong, arguing against ideology is not the same as having values. We all embrace certain values, after all. Basic humanity and compassion. Some of us promote specific values, whether it be free speech or basic fairness. The difference is that ideology warps how you see the world, because when reality doesn't conform with your preferences, you pretend otherwise. You're not allowed to think otherwise. Having a base of values doesn't require such a filter. I can believe in compassion and still process the fact that the world is often not compassionate. Some policies brought about in the name of compassion have the opposite effect. I can believe in free speech and still process the fact that speech can be harmful, requiring a response by good people to counter bad arguments and correct false information. But polarised times are a petri dish for ideologues. The number of YouTube commentators who have cultivated an audience that expects only one type of reality from them is one of the outcomes of this. If you become, for instance, a vaccine skeptic or a stolen election advocate or a climate catastrophist or whatever, there becomes a string of news stories you can no longer share or discuss without losing the support of your audience. As a recent article on the science-based medicine website highlighted, on audience capture, Heterodox figures on the COVID side can now not share a number of studies. Gave a list of a dozen examples because their audiences would actually turn against them if they did. Like the Boris Johnson backers, they follow what they perceive to be the short-term incentives. Doing it that way successfully grows their audience, makes producing the content they do very lucrative, but it means they can only say certain things. Doing it my way, talking about whatever seems to be the important studies, regardless of what the audience would wish to believe, it cultivates a highly valued audience of people prepared to expose themselves to reality, to different ideas and arguments, and it certainly makes the comment sections a bit more lively. But with the mechanism of YouTube algorithms, if your motive was to do well for yourself, then yeah, you wouldn't do it this way. But then sooner or later, reality will kick in. You can be surrounded by people who tell you that you can fly. Laws of gravity don't care. As Liz Truss discovered, as Boris Johnson also discovered, but apparently failed to learn from, there are basic rules to, the real world. Now, okay, sometimes those laws can be bent for a while. Sooner or later, reality reimposes itself. I can't help but feel that staying grounded in the facts of the world around us is really the only way to go, even when it doesn't feel like it in the short term. Especially when the world is determined to do the opposite. That is the faith on which this channel is founded. Alright, my thanks as always to the people who support this channel to enable it to do that crazy heresy in the face of the algorithm. Without the Patreon supporters, this channel could not survive. I would not be able to have the time to create the videos that I do. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.